This is Research Like a Pro, episode 228, The Effect of Pedigree Collapse on DNA Matching, a case study. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogist professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the authors of Research Like a Pro, a genealogist guide. With Robin Worthland, they also co-authored the companion volume, Research Like a Pro with DNA. Join Diana and Nicole as they discuss how to stay organized, make progress in their research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go! Hi everyone, welcome to Research Like a Pro.
Hi Nicole, how are you doing?
Hi Mom, I'm doing great. It's good to be here today to talk about pedigree collapse.
Oh great, well I know we have a lot to cover, so let's do our announcements and then we'll jump right in. Registration for Research Like a Pro with DNA will begin December 1st, 2022, and it will go from February 1st, 2023 to May 10th with 3 break weeks. So the study group will take up most of your spring if you want to join us, so plan for that. But we are excited to get going on another DNA adventure. We have our peer group leader application on our website if you're interested in a complimentary registration for being a peer group leader. And then join our newsletter for coupons, especially with the holidays coming up. We'll have some Black Friday sales coming up and holiday sales, and you'll want to take advantage of those for our courses. We are excited for Roots Tech. We are right now in the process of getting our syllabus material ready. Hard to believe we're having to do that, right, Nicole?
Yeah, I need to get started.
Yeah. So let's talk about our topic for today. And today we're talking about pedigree collapse in our DNA. Such a good topic because this can really make a difference in our DNA analysis. And if we are not aware of how to deal with it, it could be a real problem.
Yeah, some people just want to kind of avoid it and because it's hard to know what to do. So,
Right. So let's do a definition first. Pedigree collapse occurs in a person's family tree if one of their ancestral couples are related to each other. This causes the same ancestors to be repeated in their tree. For example, if a person's parents are second cousins through their great-grandparents Joseph Dyer and Anna Smith, then Joseph Dyer and Anna Smith appear in the test taker's pedigree twice. Instead of having 32 unique third great-grandparents, this test taker has 28 unique third great-grandparents.
So in the picture that goes along with this and the blog post I wrote about it, you can see that the ancestral couple appears twice. And then if instead of having them in there twice, if you just have your line connecting go up to where they are in the other spot, that's how the pedigree collapses down, because instead of having these unique people in each position in the family tree, there's some positions in the family tree that are empty because the lines are going back to somebody else, the same person in a different spot.
Right, and it leaves an empty spot where that extra set of 4 great-grandparents should be for this example.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a great illustration.
Yeah. So since we have been talking about endogamy, pedigree collapse, and multiple relationships, let's just remind everyone what the definition of these 3 terms are, because this case study actually uses both pedigree collapse and multiple relationships, which is often the case when you're working with a case like this, that it doesn't always fit neatly into one of these 3 definitions. Sometimes it's a combination of 2. So multiple relationships is different from pedigree collapse. That occurs when you have more than one common ancestral couple with a DNA match. So you're related on more than one of your family lines. Your family tree looks normal. You don't have the same ancestors in 2 positions in the tree. But when you compare your tree with the DNA matches tree, you find that between you two, you have more than one set of common ancestors who both contributed shared DNA. Pedigree collapse is a little different because it's when in your own tree you have the same ancestors in more than one position. And then pedigree collapse can become endogamy if it repeatedly occurs over many generations. But 2 or 3 instances of pedigree collapse does not make endogamy. So the definition of endogamy is when related people reproduce within the same population for hundreds of years, generations and generations. And if your ancestry is endogamous, you will have multiple distant ancestors repeated in your family tree over and over. And so this is just like extreme, severe pedigree collapse over a long time.
Right. And sometimes it's hard to know when one ends and one begins. But the important thing is just to realize it does affect how you look at the DNA. And so that's what we're working on with this series, understanding how to use DNA with these situations in the family tree.
Right.
So, how do you find out if a test taker has pedigree collapse?
Well, the best way is to look at their tree, but one way you can check to see if a DNA test taker has the same common ancestors on both their maternal and paternal sides is to use the Are Your Parents Related tool at GEDmatch. And this is a free tool that can help you figure out if there are any runs of homozygosity or ROH, which indicate segments of DNA where the test taker's parents contributed identical DNA at the same location, meaning the parents match DNA at that spot. So all you need is to have your DNA transferred over to GEDmatch or your test taker, and you can use this free tool. And it's pretty easy to just put the kit number in the tool, and then it returns results and tells you there's no runs of homozygosity or there are some runs of homozygosity. And that just means a segment of DNA that in the tool is green, meaning that the maternal chromosome matches the paternal chromosome in that spot. And it will tell you how long the segment is. And if there's a lot of that, then the parents were related more closely. And if there's only like a few small segments of the runs of homozygosity, then the parents were related more distantly.
But that tool is only on GEDmatch, right? So you have to upload your DNA wherever it comes from, whichever company, to GEDmatch, and then use the tool there.
Right. And there's another tool, I believe, at David Pike's website.
Okay, well, that is an interesting thing. And you might be wondering why you'd really need to use this. Well, we are often using test results from other people, not just ourselves. We may know our pedigree really well, but say we ask someone to share their results with us and we want to use their DNA test results, and maybe they don't even have a tree or they don't know their tree as well. This would be a great thing to do just right at the beginning to make sure you're not going to be dealing with pedigree collapse or endogamy.
Yeah, exactly.
So, have you ever found someone with runs of homozygosity with this tool?
I recently did, and it's a person who's a DNA match to my father-in-law on all the different sites, and I was looking at his tree on Family Tree DNA, and I didn't notice the pedigree collapse. But then when I ran the Are Your Parents Related tool at GEDmatch, he had two short runs of homozygosity, revealing that his parents are distantly related. So once I knew that, I looked more carefully at his pedigree and saw one of the surnames repeated in the third great grandparent level and followed them back to see that they both descended from the same ancestral couple. So his parents ended up being third cousins once removed and also third cousins. So they were
Mm,
related twice. There was also another instance of pedigree collapse further back on his paternal line, but it only affected the paternal side, and his mother wasn't related to that side. So he had a couple instances of pedigree collapse. And so I took his tree and I put it into the Exploring Family Trees visualization tool at learnforeverlearn.com/ancestors. And that is the tool you might have seen before that can help you visualize pedigree collapse and endogamy. And it kind of shows these curved lines going back to the same ancestor when the pedigree collapses. So that was kind of interesting to see that. And you can look in the blog post that accompanies this podcast to see what it looks like. But if you have a GEDCOM, you can upload that to learnforeverlearn.com/ancestors and you can see what it looks like in your tree to have the same ancestors repeated in
yeah,
multiple positions.
I really like that visual. And this is strictly on a family tree. This has nothing to do with DNA. This is strictly using a GEDCOM, which is just your family tree file, correct?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's what I like about the Are Your Parents Related tool because that one is just a DNA tool. It just looks at the DNA to see if the parents have any overlapping segments, the maternal and paternal chromosome matching. And that won't catch all pedigree collapse because if you just have pedigree collapse on only one of the parents' side, like your paternal grandparents married each other or something, then it won't show up as runs of homozygosity with you. So you would have to test your father for that one.
Okay, that is so interesting. So, how does this pedigree collapse affect DNA match analysis? Can you still compare expected amounts of DNA sharing with actual amounts for evidence of a relationship. We're so used to using DNA Painter's shared centimorgan project tool to verify our relationships, but as we are learning and as we're working at it, we're finding that pedigree collapse has some impact on that. So what are you finding?
You still can compare the expected amounts of DNA with the actual amounts for evidence, but it's trickier. You have to do some different things. You can't use the shared centimorgan project. It doesn't work with pedigree collapse and endogamy. So let's do a case study showing how we can do this with Glenn Hopper. The test taker for this Hopper case does not have any known pedigree collapse in their own family tree, but then the discovery of a close DNA match who did have pedigree collapse on the relevant line caused additional analysis to be done. So let me tell you about this. So Glenn Hopper was born in 1902. He was the son of Susan Hopper and an unknown father. And family lore stated that Glenn's father was Dan Daniel, a coal miner. And evidence from Y-DNA testing did point to the father of Glenn's surname being Daniel. However, the Social Security application that Glenn created in his lifetime stated that his father's name was Robert Daniel, not Dan Daniel.
Oh, interesting. I wonder if that is a Welsh name. I was just learning a little bit about Wales, and they seem to have names like that where they have the first name and the last name be similar. And they were coal
Right?
miners.
Yeah, Thomas and whatnot.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so you have got the DNA match who has pedigree collapse. So that can affect anybody because we don't know what our DNA matches have in their trees.
Right. Yeah, we have to be very careful as we analyze the pedigrees of our matches.
Okay, so you have this Y DNA evidence that showed the surname was Daniel, and you've got these clues of Dan or a Robert Daniel. So, what did you do to further your objective with autosomal DNA? Because Y DNA you have to use along with autosomal.
Right. The Daniel surname matches had a common ancestor in the 1700s, and this was focused in 1902. So we needed to use autosomal DNA to figure it out with more close matches. So, to determine the father of Glenn Hopper, whether it was Robert Daniel or some other man, the autosomal DNA results of one of Glenn's children were analyzed. A close DNA match was discovered, and we will call him Joseph, which is not his real name, just for privacy. And he shared 239 centimorgans with Glenn's child, our test taker. And looking at Joseph's tree, several ancestors with the surname Hopper and Daniel jumped out. And at first, the most obvious set of common ancestors with Joseph was Robert Anderson Hopper and Susan Pollard on Glenn's mother's side, because we already knew Glenn's mother's side of the tree. Glenn's father's side was empty, with just the surname Daniel as the clue. At first, we saw the common ancestor on Glenn's mother's side, and that was a third cousin once removed relationship. But according to the Shared Centimorgan Project, third cousins once removed on average share 48 centimorgans, or from 0 to 192. Joseph and Glenn's child shared 239 outside of that range. So that tipped us off that more relationships likely exist than just that one common ancestral couple. So looking at Joseph's tree, we saw Robert Daniel in his tree. So that's one of our hypotheses, that Glenn's father was this Robert Daniel. Could we just use that relationship and say, yep, Robert Daniel's the father?
That'd be easy.
That would be an erroneous assumption, right? Because there's already another relationship besides that one on the mother's side. So if that hypothesis is correct, there's already multiple relationships, right?
Yeah.
So Joseph's grandmother was a daughter of Robert Daniel. So if Robert Daniel was the father of Glenn, then Glenn's child and Joseph are half first cousins once removed, in addition to third cousins once removed on Glenn's mother's side.
Oh, it's so confusing. If you are listening and confused, just look at the blog post and see the diagram. That's the tricky thing. You really cannot visualize these types of multiple relationships or pedigree collapse without drawing diagrams. You can't wrap your head around it. But I think it's such a good point that you made, that when you start seeing these surnames appearing multiple times, that's such a good indication that you've got something going on.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we've got this hypothesis, and you've got inflated amount of DNA. What does the Shared Centimorgan Project say about this? Because you've got two different relationships, right, going on?
Right. So Like I said, for the third cousin once removed relationship, that was an average of 48. But since we're hypothesizing there's also a half first cousin once removed relationship, the Shared Centimorgan Project says for that, that the average is 224 with a range of 62 to 469. So, with Joseph and Glenn's child sharing 239 centimorgans, it seems closer to the 224 average of the half first cousin once removed. But then, if you add 48 centimorgans, which is the amount for third cousin once removed, to 224, you get 272. So, with multiple relationships, you can use this strategy to estimate the expected amount of shared DNA. You just take the average for each relationship that you found in the two trees and you add it up. So 48 plus 224 equals 272. So if you're seeing two relationships like that, you can say this is an average expected amount that you might see and say, okay, well, 239 is pretty similar to 272. But this strategy is not one you can use for pedigree collapse or endogamy. So it only works for multiple relationships. And after reviewing Joseph's pedigree further, we see that Joseph's great grandparents were Robert Daniel and Etta Hopper, and they were first cousins who got married to each other. So this results in pedigree collapse in Joseph's tree. So his third great grandparents, Marcus Daniel and Martha Mays, are in his tree twice. They're occupying two different positions. So Joseph received extra DNA from them, possibly causing him to share even more DNA with Glenn's child, if our hypothesis is correct, that Robert Daniel was Glenn's father. So if Robert Daniel was Glenn's father, Glenn's child has 3 distinct relationship paths with Joseph.
Oh, wow. That is a lot and that is tricky. I had a question for you. How did you discover all of this? Did this test taker, Joseph, have a good tree?
Yeah, he did.
Okay, so you were able to look at the tree and see it all.
Yep. Just looking at his tree, you can see all the hoppers and the Daniel people, and just, okay, here we go. There's a bunch of them.
So, that is just such a good point because if you have a DNA match and they don't have a good tree, then you have to build it or figure it out. And so we really want to use those amounts of shared DNA from the Shared Centimorgan Project to tip us off that there might be something else going on. Because if there's no tree
Yeah.
or if it's an unknown parentage case,
Uh-huh.
and you've got something out there you just don't know and things aren't adding up, it could be multiple relationships or the pedigree collapse. So it's just good to be
Yeah.
aware of this.
Well, and it just reminds me of the standard about reviewing the matches pedigrees and not just focusing on, oh, I built this one line out and this is where the common ancestor is. I can ignore that other side of the pedigree that's empty.
Yeah.
Because if we're using that as evidence, we could be using it wrong if we don't realize that there are other possible relationships.
Oh, yeah. And it also reminds me of something that we hear a lot in genetic genealogy, that the DNA doesn't lie, but the analysis can be wrong. And I think this points to a really good example of how the analysis could really be wrong if we're not taking into account these other
Right.
relationships.
Yeah, if I didn't notice all these other relationships, I might just say, oh, Robert Daniel is the father of Glenn Hopper because look, they share this amount that's consistent with half first cousin once removed.
Right,
So that must be it.
right.
All right. So with pedigree collapse now added in, we need a new strategy to use the match with Joseph as evidence for or against the hypothesis, because we can't just add up all these different relationships from the Shared Centimorgan Project, these averages, because we have to kind of break it down into these distinct relationship paths. And because our test taker doesn't have pedigree collapse, but our match does, that's one really good reason why we need to break it down into distinct relationship paths. And we can't use the Shared Centimorgan Project because the test taker only has the ancestral couple in their tree once, but the match has the ancestral couple in their tree twice. So it would be too much DNA if we use the average from the Shared Centimorgan Project. And so we really need to just focus on finding these distinct paths and then estimating the amount of DNA for each path and adding them up. At first, we might think we could just go add up those averages. And so we would get 48 centimorgans for first cousin once removed. And we would add that up twice. And then we would add up 224 for half first cousin once removed. And that would give us 320 centimorgans. But that's not going to be a correct estimate for the expected amount of shared DNA. And one issue with that method is that the shared centimorgan project is biased to be high because some third cousins, once removed, won't match at all. But people who are self reporting their matches to the shared centimorgan project are not likely to report that cousins don't match because they're looking at their match list and just choosing the matches that do match, right? And so volunteers who submit data are just picking, the ones that do match. Also, the volunteers who submit data are more likely to figure out the relationship with cousins who share more DNA rather than the ones lower on their list. Usually we start at the top of our list. So anyway, the average from the Shared Centimorgan Project is a little higher than, like a statistical average. And so rather than adding up the averages from the Shared Centimorgan Project when you have pedigree collapse, a better option is to use the coefficient of relationship calculation. And this helps you break down each path to all the common ancestors, like I was saying before.
Okay, so let me just recap. If you have multiple relationships, you can add up the average amounts from each relationship to get your estimate. But I thought it was really interesting what you said about the Shared Centimorgan Project bias to be on the high end, because that makes total sense. If you are sharing more DNA with those relationships further back, you're going to report it. And the ones you don't share much with, you just won't know. So that's such a good thing to keep in mind. So we need to use this coefficient of relationship in working with pedigree collapse. So tell us more about that.
Right. So that works with pedigree collapse, it works with endogamy, and it works with multiple relationships. But what doesn't work with pedigree collapse and endogamy is adding up the averages from the Shared Centimorgan Project. So that one's not a good strategy for when you have pedigree collapse. So when you have pedigree collapse, we need to use a calculation called coefficient of relationship. And this helps you estimate the expected amount of shared DNA between two people. And it's a formula used by geneticists. It was a term coined by Sewell Wright in 1922. He originally called it the coefficient of inbreeding, and it ranges from 0 to 1, with 1 being the most related and 0 being the least related. And so the first thing you do to use this formula is identify each individual who is a common ancestor between the two people. And so a straightforward example of this would be first cousins. They share two most recent common ancestors, their grandfather and their grandmother. And so the number of generations separating each cousin is the next thing we need to find out. And so we have cousin A, and they go 2 steps up their tree to their shared grandfather, and then 2 steps down to cousin B for a total of 4 steps. And then this is repeated for the grandmother. So up cousin A's tree to grandmother and down to cousin B, 2 more steps for 4 steps total. So you have 2 ancestors and you have 4 generational steps. And so what you do is you raise 1/2 to the 4th power for grandpa, and then raise 1/2 to the 4th power again for grandma. And that equals 1/16. And then you add 1/16 for grandma plus 1/16 for grandpa for a total of 1/8. So your coefficient of relationship is 1/8 or 0.125. So that is the same as 12.5%. So first cousins have a coefficient of relationship of 12.5% and the equivalent of about 875 centimorgans. So that's how, genetic genealogists can estimate how much DNA a person might share with their relatives.
So when we see those percentages in all the different charts, that's exactly how we have come to those numbers using the coefficient of relationship.
Right. And the reason why you're taking 1/2 and raising it to the power of how many generational steps is because you're assuming that the DNA is halved in each generation. So from you to your parent, half, and then half again. So that brings us to 1/4 from a grandparent, and then half again, and each generational step in half.
Yeah, that makes sense. And nobody told me I'd have to do math when I did genealogy. And apparently with DNA, we have to do math, right?
We were just maybe thinking you'd have to like subtract some years to calculate like, birth years. Easy math.
Have to do its easy math, not this stuff. But actually, it's really nice, and you've explained it really well in the blog post with some really good visuals. Especially, I think the thing that's important to understand is just that whole idea of the steps. From the test taker all the way up to the common ancestor, and then back down to the DNA match. And so, for those listening, take a look at the blog posts and check that out so you can kind of get that in your head, how you get those steps. So now tell us a little bit more about breaking down the distinct relationship paths.
Okay, this is a tricky concept. So it's important to remember that each ancestor, each person or individual in the tree is considered a separate relationship path rather than thinking of ancestral couples being grouped together in the relationship paths. Because we often in genetic genealogy think of common ancestral couples. But when calculating the coefficient of relationship, we need to think of each ancestor separately. So, with the Hopper example, we need to list each common ancestor between Glenn's child and Joseph, including those who are in Joseph's pedigree twice due to pedigree collapse. Then we'll count the number of generations separating them all. And I used a lucid chart to do this. And so I mapped out all 5 of the relationship paths because even though I said there were 3 ways they're related, there's 5 relationship paths. 1 for the half first cousin once removed, and then 2 for the third cousin once removed, and then 2 more for the other third cousin once removed relationship, because both of those 2 had 2 ancestors in common. So there's 5 total paths to an individual in the tree. The way that I did this was using Lucid Chart to kind of map each of the 5 paths out. And then on the connecting lines, connecting each box, I added a small blue number on the line to count how many steps there were. So for the first one, Robert Daniel, the hypothesis is that he was the father of Glenn. And so if he was the father, then Susan was the mother. And so his wife, Etta Hopper, she had a daughter named Elsie that was Joseph's grandmother. And so there was only that one common ancestor because he would have had 2 relationships if he was the father. He would have had a relationship with Susan Hopper and then a relationship with Etta Hopper. That's why it's a half. Anyway, so there are 5 generations separating Glenn's child and Joseph. So we start with Glenn's child and we go up 2 steps, and then we're at Robert Daniel, and then we go down 3 steps to Joseph. And so that's 5. So we would take 1/2 raised to the 5th power, which is 1/32, or 0.03125. So that's our first one. So the next relationship path is to Robert Anderson Hopper and Susan Pollard. And so Glenn's child and Joseph are third cousins once removed through these 2 common ancestors. So from Glenn's child up to Robert Anderson Hopper is 4 steps, and down to Joseph is 5 steps since they're in different generations, for a total of 9 generations of separation. And then it's the same exact number for Susan, up 4 and down 5 for a total of 9. So we would raise 1/2 to the 9th power, which is 1/512. And that's the same as 0.001953. So then you would add those 2 together for those 2 relationship paths.
So I have a question here because this is not a half relationship. He's related through this couple. You do the calculation for both the man and the wife?
Yeah, because you have to consider that both of those 2 individuals contributed DNA and not just, one of them.
So that's how they get the percentages for the half relationships versus the full relationships.
Right. So we have 1/2 to the 9th plus 1/2 to the 9th for those 2 relationship paths. And then for the last ancestral couple, Marcus Daniel and Martha Daniel. So although they already appear in Joseph's pedigree as the grandparents of Robert Daniel, they also appear in another spot in Joseph's pedigree as the grandparents of Etta Hopper. So we need to include this path in our calculation to account for the extra DNA they passed through Etta to Joseph. So we would go up the pedigree from Glenn's child to Robert Daniel, the hypothesis, and continue going up to Marcus Daniel and Martha Daniel, and then down 5 more steps to Joseph. And this time we would go through Etta Hopper instead of through Robert Daniel, like we did in our first relationship path with Robert Daniel. And so 1/2 to the ninth power is 1 over 512. And we would do that twice and add those together. So we are adding up for all these 5 relationship paths, the first one, which was 0.03125, and then all the other ones were 1/2 to the ninth. So we can do 4 multiplied by 0.001935 and add that to 0.3125, which makes a coefficient of relationship of 0.039 or 3.9%. So that's a lot of numbers, but just know you can look at the blog post to see all of the explanations for that.
Right. And so we are usually used to using number of centimorgans to compare our DNA matches to our test takers. So we do see these percentages on some of the DNA testing websites, but how do we translate that into centimorgans?
Right. That's exactly what I wanted to do first as well. Like, what does this mean in terms of centimorgans? So, to convert a percentage or the coefficient of relationship into centimorgans, we can multiply the coefficient by 7,000 centimorgans. So, 0.039 times 7,000 centimorgans equals 273 centimorgans.
Oh,
So,
interesting.
this coefficient of relationship formula predicts that Glenn's child should share about 273 with Joseph if Robert Daniel is the father of Glenn. The actual amount they share is 239, which is pretty close. So that's just a difference of 34 centimorgans. So it could be that our hypothesis is correct. In the past, many have used 6,800 centimorgans as the total genome size to multiply by when converting percentages of shared DNA into centimorgans. However, Leah Larkin reviewed my article and suggested using 7,000 centimorgans instead of 6,800 centimorgans because that 6,800 was based on an old map by Family Tree DNA. And she says that the genome size at each testing company varies, but most are either slightly over or under 3,500 centimorgans. And when you double that for both sets of chromosomes, maternal and paternal, the total genome size would be 7,000.
Oh, that's good to know. And those are nice round numbers. 3,500 from each parent, 7,000 total. I like
Mhm.
that. All right, so this is all with that first hypothesis for the father of Glenn Hopper. And in an unknown parentage case, we often need to have another hypothesis to test. So, did you have another hypothesis, and what would that be?
Yes. So, in order to get to proof for these kind of cases, we need to eliminate all the other hypotheses so that you're only left with one conclusion that could be right. So, we need to test some other ones to see if they would also work. So, we looked, at the family of Robert Daniel, and he had a bunch of older brothers. So, perhaps one of Robert Daniel's older brothers, James, George, Luther, or Jesse, was the father of Glenn. In that case, we would need to adjust one part of our coefficient of relationship estimate. And instead of having a half first cousin once removed relationship with Joseph through Robert Daniel, Glenn's child would be a second cousin once removed through the parents of Robert Daniel, Marcus Daniel Jr. and Jane Hopper. The coefficient of relationship calculation would now include 2 paths, one to Marcus Daniel Jr. and one to Jane Hopper, the parents of Robert Daniel. And so then we would have 6 paths instead of 5, but they would be a little bit further back and more generations of separation. As a side note here, you might be wondering, oh no, another person with the surname Hopper. And that's correct. We saw that as well. Jane Hopper, are they related again through this woman? So far, the research has found that she was not a daughter of Robert Anderson Hopper and Susan Pollard, but her parentage is unknown. We assume she is probably related further back, but research is ongoing on that. So there could be yet another instance of pedigree collapse from that for both the test taker and the match. That's another confounding factor in our hypothesis. But back to this second hypothesis here. With this hypothesis, the calculation for the coefficient of relationship came out to 2.34%. And to express this in centimorgans, we multiply by 7,000, which is 164 centimorgans. So that's a little bit lower than the amount that Joseph and Glenn share, which is 239. And so that's 75 centimorgans less. So both hypotheses actually seem possible, right? They're not that far away from how much they share. And with the confounding factor of Jane Hopper and possibly more pedigree collapse distantly in the tree, it's possible that that could be contributing extra DNA as well. Unfortunately, after doing these calculations, we cannot make a conclusion. We need to do more work. So we don't know which hypothesis is accurate because they're both kind of falling close enough where, because of random recombination, some people just inherit a little more or a little less than the average statistical amount that you would expect them to share based on having the DNA in each generation. I inherited 28% from one of my grandparents and 22 from the other. So it's not an actual forced one half every time. It's only one half for your parents, but then from grandparents it could be 20 and 30.
And it gets more pronounced, that difference, as you go further back on the family tree. We see second or third cousins that are brothers and sisters or first cousins, and they're matching much differently than you would expect. So it can get tricky with that random recombination.
It can. And because we only talked about one data point in this case study, it's hard to see if the amount of shared DNA we observe between Glenn's child and Joseph is an outlier. If we had several data points and they all pointed to, clustering around this being closer with Robert as Glenn's father, then we would have a stronger case. But we would also need to eliminate Robert's brothers as potential fathers. And one way to do this is by testing descendants of his brothers and his other siblings.
Right. We're always looking for more people that can add further evidence to our DNA conclusions. So, what were your final conclusions?
The intermediate conclusion is that both hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2 are possible. And the future research that needs to be done is to identify additional test takers and matches to confirm or reject the hypothesis that Robert Daniel was the father. Of course, we have some documentary evidence pointing to him on the Social Security application. So it seems that that's slightly more likely than the others. But because there was already a conflict with the family information saying Dan Daniel, we wonder if there was some kind of confusion or not wanting to tell the truth about it. So we can't take that as truth.
Right.
It would be confirmation bias to say, okay, well, it looks like this is what it says in documentary evidence. And so we're just going to go with that because that hypothesis seems to work. First, we need to eliminate the other brothers. One way to prioritize additional test takers is to focus on any test takers whose ancestors did not intermarry with the same population. And Paul Woodbury calls these genetic pioneers. And this is super important for endogamy. And it can also be useful for pedigree collapse. And so we would hopefully try to find a test taker who descends from one of the brothers of Robert Daniel who doesn't have any extra Hopper ancestors in their tree beyond what's
Right.
already intermarried between Robert Daniel married Etta Hopper.
It's always so exciting when you can find someone that moved away from the mess, and then you can test one of their descendants and see if you can get a little bit cleaner tree without all of the pedigree collapse or multiple relationships. So that's a good concept too. I just think it's really important to remember that we have to have more than one test taker generally, like you said, data points. We can't just rely on our own DNA or the DNA of our parent to prove something when we have these really difficult cases. And especially if we've got something that's so close, like these two different hypotheses. Well, now that we've talked through some of this information about coefficient of relationship, I'm sure everyone listening would like to know where they can go to learn more. Because if you listeners are like me, it's going to take a few times to get this through your head, and you'll need to look at some examples and really have some good tools for using this in your own research. So, Nicole, where do we learn more?
Right. So, in order to figure out how to do this, I read everything I could about pedigree collapse. So, I have a big list of resources at the end of the article that I consulted. And one of them was Diane Southard's blog, Your DNA Guide, and she has some really great explanations. One of the writers on their team, Jane Eakins, wrote the blog post about coefficient of relationship and pedigree collapse. So, be sure to check that one out. I also read the chapter in Advanced Genetic Genealogy by Kimberly Powell. And that one is really well done. And I reached out to her with some questions and she clarified some things for me. Her example is is great because it includes both the test taker and the DNA match having pedigree collapse. On my example, only the match had pedigree collapse. And so her example has pedigree collapse as well as multiple relationships. And, I did 5 and 6 distinct relationship paths with this case study. And her example had 10 distinct relationship paths. And they were a little bit further back. So it resulted in a coefficient of relationship of about 1.76%. And so what she used in hers was one diagram that showed all of the relationships between the match and the test taker. And she used like the genetics pedigree diagram with the males as squares and the females as circles. And then she just labeled each common ancestor with a letter A through J to succinctly identify relationship paths between them. And so she lists out all 10 relationship paths, saying like through A, E, and H, and then through A, J, and H, and stuff like that. So it was really helpful to trace those paths in her diagram and then see the list of them and then see how she calculated each one. And hers were like 1/2 raised to the 9th power, 1/2 raised to the 10th power. So they were a little more distant. Go check out that chapter in the book, Advanced Genetic Genealogy, edited by Debbie Parker Wayne. And Kimberly also shows 2 methods of calculating the expected amount of shared DNA with pedigree collapse. The coefficient of relationship, of course, like I've been saying, but also using the expected percentages of shared DNA for relationships based on the autosomal DNA statistics page at the ISOG wiki. And for this method, Kimberly used a matrix showing the relationships between the test taker and the match and the expected percentages of DNA. Then she added up all these percentages, and the answer was very similar to the coefficient of relationship calculation. So if you want to do it that way, you might prefer that. Both are good.
Yeah, I'm looking at that chapter right now, and I had read this book when it first came out, but it's been a while, and I am loving all of the visuals that Kimberly's got in this chapter. So if you're really interested in learning more about DNA and some of these more complicated scenarios, you'll probably want to get the book Advanced Genetic Genealogy Techniques and Case Studies, which has got several chapters by all sorts of different genetic genealogists, and it is edited by Debbie Parker Wayne. So good tool to have on hand when you run up against something like this.
And you can even get the book from the library. And that's what one of our colleagues has done when she needs to consult it. But I had to ask Kimberly because when I was looking at the diagram, image 6.7, I felt like there was one connecting line missing and I just couldn't figure out how it was going to work out without that line. And so I asked her and she said, yes, that line got deleted in the final draft somehow. And so in my blog post in the footnote for that, you can see she sent me a couple of corrections for that. And one of the relationship paths was raised to the wrong power. So anyways, it's sad because Debbie Parker Wayne passed away. And so she's not going to be able to do a new edition of the book eventually. So if you have questions, you can always reach out to the chapter authors.
That's so disappointing when you've worked so hard on a chapter and have all of your diagrams perfect. And then in the printing or the editing or, how that happens, that something gets messed up. Oh, darn it.
Yeah, and it's a big loss for the genetic genealogy community.
Yeah.
With the passing of Debbie Parker Wayne a couple years ago.
She was such a pioneer in genetic genealogy and just did so much to explain and teach.
Yeah, I'm really grateful for the book that she put together. I mean, I've consulted it many times, and it's just great to have experts sharing more advanced information.
Well, my very first book that I studied was edited by Debbie or written by Debbie and Blaine Bettinger. It's Genetic Genealogy in Practice. And I took that book and worked on it every day and studied it so I could learn the basics of DNA. And it was extremely helpful as a good foundation. So even though it's, now it's getting a little bit old, but the basic DNA principles have certainly not changed of inheritance and how you work with it. So this book was written, or it was copyrighted in 2016, which isn't that old, I guess. But the world of DNA
but it's so
changes.
Crazy how much it changes. When we edit our Research Like a Pro with DNA slides, every year we have to make all these changes.
Yes, and my lesson is on ethnicity, and every single company has done an ethnicity update by the time the next year comes around. So that's fun. But I love it. I think it's great that we're constantly getting updates. It's really neat. Well, let's wrap up this podcast with your main takeaways after you've done all this study to write this and teach us all about it. What should we remember?
So the takeaways for this case study are checking for runs of homozygosity with the GEDmatch tool. Are your parents related? Which I didn't use with the Glenn Hopper case study, but it's just such a good, easy way if your test taker or match is at GEDmatch to quickly find out if there's pedigree collapse, and it's free. Another takeaway is that you can visualize a GEDCOM file to see pedigree collapse at learnforeverlearn.com/ancestors using the Exploring Family Trees visualization tool. Another takeaway is to be careful when you review pedigrees of a test taker and a match, looking for pedigree collapse or multiple relationships, and extending that pedigree back as far as you can on all lines is really important. If pedigree collapse occurs in one of your DNA matches trees and the MRCA couple is in their tree twice, that's going to impact it if it's on the MRCA couple that's in there twice. If they have pedigree collapse with a different couple that's not the MRCA couple, then that may not be relevant to your match with them. So just check for those inflated amounts of shared DNA. Another takeaway, calculate the coefficient of relationship to estimate expected amounts of shared DNA for each relationship path to a common ancestor. And then if there's pedigree collapse, then that ancestral couple could appear as a separate path. And then what do you do about all this? Well, you incorporate more test takers and focus on genetic pioneers. Consider Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA tests. Those direct line tests are often very helpful in untangling pedigree collapse and endogamy. And we had used that Y-DNA test to help us figure out the surname for Glenn Hopper's father, and that ended up being helpful. And then lastly, be sure to reach out to those who have worked with pedigree collapse before for advice. And I did that with this article, and I was really grateful to receive feedback from Leah Larkin and Kimberly Powell and Paul Woodbury and a couple of our colleagues that I work with at Family Locket Genealogists. So thank you to Yvonne and to all of the people who helped me make sure I had this right.
Yeah, it's one thing to read about it, it's another thing to actually work with it, and it's even harder to write about it and to make sure that you have it really understood. But it's really a good way to get it really internalized because now you've got this down.
Right? Before, I understood it in theory, but now I understand it more in practice because applying it, you have to really dive in and make sure you get the concept
You really do.
fully.
You do. And I think that's why we enjoy doing our client work so much because we get to try so many different projects, and why we enjoy our study groups because we get to see so many different examples. And we wanted to do this entire series on endogamy, multiple relationships, and pedigree collapse because we see this over and over in our study groups with people doing the leads method and then thinking, oh, I've got endogamy or I've got pedigree collapse, so being able to really understand what each one of those scenarios is and how the DNA works is just so helpful. And I'm excited that we are doing this series, and hopefully it's helping everyone listen to it, at least to just know that it's out there. And when you need to, you can refer back to these podcasts or blog posts to learn more.
Right. And, we didn't talk at all about the effect of pedigree collapse on clustering, but we do have a blog post in the works. So that'll be coming out soon to kind of look at it from a clustering standpoint and genetic networks and how that pedigree collapse can make that a little more fuzzy.
Right, right. Well, I think it's just encouraging that even though you've got some of these sticky situations in your family tree or those of your DNA matches, there are ways to work with them. And we don't just have to throw our hands up in the air and say, oh, it's impossible. There's some stuff we can do. And I think that's always really good to know. And people are figuring out better and better ways to work with it too, which is exciting.
It is exciting. And, even like right after I published this, I got an email from somebody who is working on a tool to help calculate the coefficient of relationship more efficiently. So that's exciting.
Right. Every time we talk about these really tricky things to calculate or figure out, my hope is always that someone will do a tool. And you know that, that I can just plug my data into and it will tell me something. So,
Well, hey, that actually happened recently with the coverage estimator.
I know. See, I just had to wait for the tool, and then I didn't have to learn how to do it myself.
That was a tricky one. Yeah, we had talked on the podcast about calculating coverage, and I think kind of at the same time that we were talking about that, Paul Woodbury and Leah Larkin and Johnny Pearl were working on making a tool. And so now you can find that coverage estimator tool at DNA Painter. It's pretty
It
great.
is pretty great. Yep. We love it. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and thanks Nicole for doing all this work. I know it was a lot of work for you to get this all down in a good example that we could understand. So I encourage everyone to go check out the blog post, listen to this podcast again, let these concepts kind of soak in, and then when you're working on your DNA research and you come across some of these situations, you'll have, at least in the back of your mind, an idea of what to do. So have a great week, everyone, and we'll talk to you next time.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our books, Research Like a Pro and Research Like a Pro with DNA on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our online courses or study groups of the same names. Learn more at familylocket.com/services. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our courses. To get updates in your email inbox each Monday, subscribe to our newsletter at familylocket.com/newsletter. Please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. We read each review and are so thankful for them. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.